Welcome back for another deep dive. This time we're exploring the fascinating world of social psychology.
Oh, it's a good one.
Yeah, we've got some excerpts from the ninth edition of Psychology by David G.
The
Myers.
classic.
Oh, for sure, specifically chapter 16. And we've also got some really intriguing real-world examples that you, our listeners, have sent in, so thank you for that.
Always love those.
Yeah, we're going to be focusing on how those kind of invisible social forces can really shape the way we think and feel and act.
It's more than you might realize.
Yeah. By the end of this deep dive, you'll not only understand how groups influence us, but also how you can apply this knowledge to your own life. So get ready for some serious aha moments.
I think you'll be surprised by just how much our environment and the people around us can impact our decisions. Even our behaviors, our actions.
Okay,
Yeah.
so let's jump right in with something I think a lot of people will have heard of. This idea of conformity and obedience. You've probably heard of the Milgram experiment. This is where participants were instructed to give electric shocks to another person,
Right.
and a whopping 63% of them obeyed, even when the learner was crying out, like in agony.
It's pretty shocking when you think about it.
Yeah, and it raises the question, why? Like, were these people secretly evil, or was there something else going on?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the answer is, it's not that they were heartless.
Okay.
Milgram was really clever. He used what we call the foot-in-the-door effect.
Okay.
He started with small shocks and then gradually increased the voltage.
Right.
Each step just seemed like a small, justifiable increment from the last.
Yeah.
So it made it really hard to draw a line in the sand and say, no, I'm not going to do that.
It's terrifyingly subtle, isn't it?
It is.
It's almost like, if you turn up the heat slowly enough, the frog in the pot won't realize it's being cooked.
Exactly. And before they knew it, these participants were administering what they believe were potentially lethal shocks.
Yeah, it's, like I said, it's terrifying. And you might be thinking, well, I would never do that.
Right.
But have you ever gone along with something at work or maybe even in like a social situation where you knew it wasn't quite right just to avoid rocking the boat?
Oh, all the time.
Yeah.
It's so relatable.
That's the foot in the door effect, isn't it?
Exactly. And it's far more common than we realize.
It is. So that's the bad news. But the good news is Milgram's experiment also had some variations
Yeah.
where they showed factors that made people less likely to obey.
It's true. Yeah.
So what were some of those?
Well, for example, obedience really dropped off if the authority figure was more distant.
Okay, so physical distance matters.
It really does.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, if the victim was closer, or if there were other people who refused to obey.
So it's like having a role model for defiance can really embolden you to do what you think is right.
Absolutely. And a powerful example of this is this French village of Le Chambon during World War II.
I've heard of this.
Yeah. The residents there collectively refused to hand over Jews to the Nazis.
Wow.
And they really demonstrated the strength of both individual and group resistance.
Amazing.
And what was really fascinating is they had these really strong shared beliefs and role models that just inspired them to act so courageously.
That's incredible. So it really shows that even in the face of this immense pressure, people can choose to do the right thing, particularly when they have the support of their community. But what about in situations where the pressure's not necessarily coming from like a specific authority figure?
Right.
What if it's coming more from the situation itself? Like, how does that influence our behavior?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and it's something we're going to delve into next.
Let's do it.
So stay tuned.
Stay with us. Okay, so we've seen how authority figures can like really influence our behavior. But what about those more subtle ways that our environment can shape our actions? So let's set the scene. You're a pro pool player. You're at a crowded bar sinking shot after shot.
Nice.
But your friend, who's still learning the game, totally chokes under pressure. What's going on there?
Well, that sounds like a classic example of what we call social facilitation.
Okay.
So basically, having an audience, all those people watching, it actually increases our arousal.
Right.
And that can actually amplify what we call our dominant response.
Okay.
So for you, the expert, you're used to it. You're going to nail those shots.
Right.
But for your friend who's less experienced, all that pressure just intensifies their mistakes.
So is it kind of like that spotlight effect, but instead of just feeling watched, our actual performance changes?
Exactly. It's not just in our heads.
Wow.
Our performance is actually affected.
Yeah.
And the key here is whether the task is easy or difficult for the individual.
Okay.
That increased arousal, it acts like a performance enhancer for the experts.
Right.
But it can be a major distraction for anyone who's less confident.
Okay, you're making me a little self-conscious now. What if I'm giving a presentation and I totally blank on something I actually know really well? Is that social facilitation too?
Absolutely.
Uh,
The same principle applies to, mental tasks as well.
mhm.
We're much more likely to rely on those quick, intuitive decisions when we're in front of other people,
Yeah.
which is great for, simple problems, but can lead to those slip-ups on the more complex stuff.
So maybe a little bit of nervousness is actually a good thing. Like it means I'm at least alert and engaged.
I think so.
But speaking of like intensified reactions, have you ever noticed how a mediocre joke can suddenly become hilarious when you're in a packed comedy club?
Oh, for sure. The energy is contagious.
Yeah. So is that the same idea at play there?
It totally is. Crowding, just like having an audience, it increases our arousal.
Oh.
And that just amplifies all our emotional responses, good or bad.
Wow.
So that mild amusement, because you're surrounded by everyone else laughing, it turns into raucous laughter.
So the energy of the crowd really does make a difference.
Absolutely.
I guess this means like even just picking the right space for a work meeting is more important than I thought.
Right.
Like a cramped, stuffy room that could make a tense meeting unbearable, but a more spacious setting that could actually help people relax and be more productive.
You're totally right. The physical environment can really impact how a group functions.
Mhm.
It influences everything from the way people communicate to the actual decisions they make.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. But okay, let's move beyond like individual reactions and talk about how groups actually interact as a whole.
All right, let's dive into group dynamics.
Yeah, and I think we should start with a concept that's been on my mind a lot lately.
Okay.
This thing called group polarization.
Okay.
It's this idea that when like-minded people get together and discuss an issue, they become even more extreme in their views.
Right.
So like if I'm hanging out with a bunch of climate activists, we'll all end up even more passionate about saving the planet, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the general idea. It might seem kind of counterintuitive, but the more we discuss our opinions with people who already agree with us, the more entrenched and extreme those opinions tend to become.
Okay, so it's not just about getting validation for your views.
Yeah.
You're actually being exposed to like more and more arguments that support your existing beliefs. So you just get more and more confident and it pushes you further along that spectrum.
Exactly. So instead of challenging our views, we're really just reinforcing them, even if those views are already pretty out there.
Is there any like research that supports this idea?
Yeah, there's this really cool study that looked at liberals in Boulder, Colorado, and conservatives in Colorado Springs. And they found that after discussing these really hot-button issues, both groups actually became even more polarized in their political stances.
So they were basically preaching to the choir and it just strengthened those existing beliefs.
Exactly.
That's a little scary, to be honest.
Yeah, something to think about.
It seems like it would be so hard to have a productive conversation with someone on the other side of the political spectrum if we're all just retreating further into our own echo chambers.
It's definitely a challenge, and it has real implications for society as a whole. It contributes to, political gridlock. It makes compromise a lot more difficult, and it just hinders that productive dialogue that we need on all these really important issues.
Yikes, that's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
And speaking of like dysfunctional group dynamics, let's talk about groupthink.
Yeah, a classic.
This is when that desire for harmony just overrides critical thinking and then bad decisions get made.
Yeah.
This sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Well, it can be, yeah. And a really good example is the Bay of Pigs invasion. President Kennedy and his advisors, they were so confident in their plan to overthrow Castro
Right.
that they just completely ignored all the warning signs and anyone who disagreed with them,
Wow.
which, led to a pretty disastrous outcome.
And so it's not just about being surrounded by yes men.
Right.
It's that pressure to conform.
Maintain that group harmony, even if it means you're ignoring, huge red flags.
Exactly.
So how do we avoid falling into that groupthink trap?
Well, one of the most important things is just encouraging diverse viewpoints.
Okay.
You want open debate, especially when the stakes are high. Leaders should actively be seeking out dissenting opinions, create that environment where it's safe to challenge assumptions, even if it leads to some discomfort.
Yeah.
You need those devil's advocates, the people who are going to poke holes in the plan and force everyone to think more critically.
I love that. It makes so much sense. Okay, so we've talked about how social pressure can lead us to conform, how group dynamics can amplify our existing beliefs. But let's dive into a topic that I think is a bit more insidious: prejudice.
Oh, okay.
We like to think that overt prejudice is declining, but is it really gone, or is it just hiding beneath the surface?
That's the big question, isn't it? Yeah, it's a big question, and it makes you wonder, like, have we truly conquered prejudice, or is it just lurking below the surface, maybe disguised in some way?
Right, and it's something we're going to explore today because while, those outward expressions of prejudice may have decreased, we really have to consider what we call implicit
An
bias.
implicit
Yeah,
bias.
these are like those unconscious feelings and beliefs that can actually influence our actions without us even realizing it.
So even if we genuinely believe, in our hearts that we treat everyone equally, our unconscious biases might still be affecting how we interact with people from different backgrounds.
Exactly, and those biases, they can have real-world consequences. Like think about hiring
Oh,
decisions.
gosh, yeah.
One study actually found that job applicants with white-sounding names were more likely to get called back for an interview than those with black-sounding names, even when their resumes were like totally identical.
Wow, that's so disheartening. It really suggests that even when we think we're being objective, these unconscious biases can still creep into our decision-making processes.
They do.
But how do we even measure something that's unconscious? Like, you can't just ask someone if they're implicitly biased and expect to get an honest answer.
You're right, it's not that simple, but luckily, researchers have developed tools like something called the implicit association test or the IAT.
AAT.
Yeah, it's a really clever way to assess how quickly people associate certain concepts, like good or bad, with different social groups.
So even if someone consciously believes that all races are equal, they might still show faster reaction times when they're linking good words with white faces and bad words with black faces.
That's exactly it. And it's not just limited to race either. The IAT has been used to study implicit biases related to gender, age, sexual orientation, all sorts of social categories.
It's incredible how much is going on beneath the surface of our awareness, and it makes you wonder how these implicit biases are playing out, in everyday situations.
Yeah, and one area where this is especially concerning is law enforcement. Studies have actually used simulations to show that people, both black and white, are quicker to mistakenly shoot black targets in these scenarios.
Oh, wow.
And it really highlights the power of what we call automatic processing. Our brains are working on two levels, conscious and unconscious.
Right.
And unfortunately, those deep-seated prejudices often, fueled by things like societal stereotypes and media representations, they can override our good intentions.
It's a scary thought that our split-second decisions can be influenced by biases we don't even realize we have.
It is, and the consequences are huge. We've seen it play out in tragic incidents where unarmed black individuals are perceived as threats and then met with deadly force.
It's a really sobering reminder that we all have a responsibility to, examine our own biases and to work towards creating a more just and equitable society.
I agree.
But, okay, implicit bias isn't the only thing that can lead to prejudice, right? What about scapegoat theory?
Oh yeah, scapegoat theory. That's a big one too. So
Yeah.
basically, when things go wrong, we often look for someone to blame. And sadly, already stigmatized groups often become easy targets for this displaced aggression. It's a way to make sense of chaos, regain a feeling of control, even if it's at the expense of others.
Like the surge in Islamophobia after 9/11.
Exactly.
Suddenly, an entire group of people was being demonized and blamed for the actions of a few extremists.
It's really unfortunate and a pattern we see throughout history when fear and uncertainty take hold, and it's all too easy to fall into that trap of scapegoating.
It's a reminder that we all need to be really vigilant and challenge prejudice,
Yeah.
whenever we encounter it, whether it's directed at ourselves or at others. But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about aggression itself.
Okay.
Is it something we're born with, or is it something we learn?
Well, aggression is a complex behavior. It's got roots in both our biology and our experiences.
Yes.
We know certain biological factors like testosterone levels and activity in certain parts of the brain can play a role.
Okay.
But our upbringing, cultural norms, and even our individual life experiences also have a massive impact.
So it's not a straightforward nature versus nurture debate. It's way more nuanced than that.
Exactly. It's much more complicated than that.
It's kind of like having a gun. We all have the potential for aggression,
Right.
but whether or not that trigger gets pulled really depends on this really complex mix of individual and social factors.
That's a great analogy. And, those triggers can vary so widely based on things like early childhood experiences, cultural norms, exposure to violence, and even environmental stressors like poverty or social inequality.
It makes you wonder if media can teach us violence. Can it also teach us peace? If we can learn to be aggressive through exposure to violent content, can we also learn to be more empathetic and compassionate through exposure to positive and pro-social content?
That's a really thought-provoking question and one that researchers are actively exploring.
Mm.
There's growing evidence that pro-social media, like shows and games that promote cooperation and empathy, can have a really positive impact on our behavior.
Okay, so there's hope for humanity yet?
I think so.
Well, we've covered so much ground today, from the subtle ways we conform to those really complex roots of prejudice and aggression. It's been a fascinating deep dive into the world of social psychology.
Absolutely. It's incredible to see how much our environment and the people around us can influence our thoughts, our feelings, and even our actions.
It really is, but the good news is understanding these forces is a huge step towards resisting them and creating a more just and compassionate world.
Absolutely.
We're not just puppets at the mercy of our social environment. We have the power to choose how we respond to these influences and to work towards creating a better future for ourselves and, for generations to come.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those hearts open.